Most people think wealth changes when you hit a lucky year. That is not how it works. Wealth changes when the machine changes. At the beginning, you are the machine. You work, you save, you sacrifice, you transfer money out of your life and into an account that seems almost rude in how little it gives back. That is the first phase. And it is the phase where most people quit. Not because they are lazy, because the numbers insult them, you put in effort, the account gives you almost nothing that feels dramatic. You say no to dinners, trips, upgrades, random spending, and half your reward is a graph that still looks weak enough to make doubt feel intelligent. That is where most people die financially, not at the end, at the beginning in the quiet. Humiliating stretch where they are still doing all the lifting and the money is barely helping. That is why I want to start with a hard truth. The first stage of wealth building is not inspiring. It is mechanical. It is repetitive. It is mostly you dragging the stone uphill while everyone around you thinks you are being extreme for a future that still looks too small to justify the effort. That is the real beginning. And if you want the mother line for everything I am about to tell you, here it is. The 3 net worth milestones that change everything are not important because they are round numbers. They matter because each one changes the ratio between your effort and your money. Effort, until eventually the machine that used to depend on you starts running with much less help from you. That is the line. That is the thing I want fixed in your mind. Because once you understand that, you stop checking your investment account like a nervous amateur looking for emotional validation. You start reading the journey correctly. First, you are the engine, then you and the money become partners, then the money becomes strong enough to do work that used to require your labor. That is what the milestones mean. Not status, not bragging rights, machine transition. That is a very different way to think, and it is a much better way to stay in the game long enough to win it. Most people never learn this. They think saving and investing should feel rewarding early. They think consistency should be enough to feel exciting. They think discipline should produce fast, visible proof. Early wealth building is mostly a test of whether you can keep acting correctly while the visible payoff is still too small to flatter your ego. That is the actual test. And because most people are not psychologically prepared for that test, they keep starting and stopping. They contribute for a while, then they pause, then life gets expensive, then the account still looks small, then they tell themselves they will return later when they earn more. Later becomes years. Years become drift. And drift destroys more wealth than bad luck ever will. I do not want that for you. So let me show you what is really happening under the surface. I call the first mechanism the blue zone. The blue zone is the stage where almost all of your wealth growth comes from your own contributions, not from the returns on the money already invested. That is the beginning. And it is psychologically brutal. If you put away $50 a month for years, you can look at the account and feel almost offended by how much of it is still your own effort. The blue part of the chart dominates the green part. Your labor dominates the market. Help. That is why so many people feel like they are doing everything right and still not getting anywhere. Because in this phase, that feeling is partly true. You are doing almost all the work. The money is not lazy. The base is too small. That is the distinction. A person at this stage can make a terrible mistake. He can interpret slow compounding as proof that compounding is weak. Wrong compounding is not weak. It is simply too early for its shape to feel powerful. This is what I wish more people understood. Compounding is not magical at small scale. It is subtle. You do not start by seeing fireworks. You start by seeing tiny proofs that your money is beginning to earn on top of what it earned before. That sounds trivial. It is not. It is the first crack in the old reality where labor was doing everything. Let me say this cleanly. If you invest 100 and it grows to 110, the first 10 is nice. If the next year it grows on 110 instead of 100, the extra dollar that appears from growth on growth is small enough to feel laughable. Fine, that extra dollar is still a revolution in miniature, because it means your money is no longer only receiving labor. It is beginning to produce small production at first, still production, that is the blue zone. And if you cannot emotionally survive the blue zone, you never reach the stages that make all the later wealth appear lucky to people who quit early. That is why I say the first milestone matters so much. Not because 10,000 changes your life directly, because 10,000 is where the game finally becomes real enough that your effort has built something with a pulse that matters a lot. Now let me take you deeper. The crowd thinks the point of the first milestone is the money. The first milestone proves identity. It proves you can follow a system. It proves you can stay consistent while the applause is missing. It proves you can turn investing from a temporary mood into a habit that is worth more than the amount itself. Because if you can build the first meaningful base, you can build the second one. If you cannot build the first, the later numbers are just fantasy wallpaper. This is why I do not laugh at 10,000. A lot of people do. They say it is not enough for a house, not enough for retirement, not enough to change anything. That is shallow thinking. 10,000 is the first proof that the machine obeys you. That is what changes. Not your lifestyle yet, your relationship with the process. And that is where a lot of people finally become dangerous to drift. Now let me give you the second mechanism. I call it the 10K proof. The 10K proof is the point where wealth building stops being a theory and becomes visible enough to force a psychological change. Definition is simple. You built enough capital that time can now do something interesting with it, even if you did nothing else from that point onward. That is what shocks people. They imagine that if they stopped contributing after 10,000, nothing meaningful would happen wrong at a reasonable long-term return. 10,000 left alone for decades becomes real money. Not luxury, maybe still real. That is the point. The account is no longer only a container. It is a seed that matters because the human brain needs proof. It needs something more tangible than this will matter later. It wants a number big enough to feel real and small enough to still be reachable by an ordinary, disciplined person. That is why 10,000 matters. It is the first number that says, if I leave you alone, I can still become something. Now, I want to say something more important. The public treats the first milestone as a finish line. It is not. It is an ignition point. The danger here is that people feel relief and misread relief as license to relax. That is too early. Way too early. The 10K proof should not make you stop. It should make you trust the machine enough to continue. The point is not, great, I proved it works. Now I can coast emotionally. The point is, great, I proved it works. Now I will not quit before the curve begins bending. That is how you should treat it. The first milestone is not important because it solves your life. It is important because it removes the excuse that the process is imaginary. That excuse dies at 10,000. After that, you are no longer asking whether the machine works. You are deciding whether you are serious enough to keep feeding it. That is a different question, a much harder one. And this is why the first milestone is so often missed by people who are otherwise capable. They do not fail because they are ignorant of the number. They fail because the blue zone lasted longer than their patience. That is what I want you to remember. Patience is not passive here. It is production under conditions of insufficient emotional reward. That is real patience. And if you can build it, you are already more dangerous than the majority of people who talk about wealth all day and never sit still long enough to grow any. Now let me take you into something even more useful. A workplace pension or employer contribution changes the early game more than most people understand. Why? Because free matching money and tax relief are not little bonuses. They are speed. They help you get through the blue zone faster. That is what makes them so powerful. If you put in 80 and someone else adds 20, the machine reaches proof sooner. If your employer matches a contribution, you are not merely saving. You are accelerating the point at which compounding gets enough weight to matter. That is not abstract. That is time compression. And time compression is one of the most valuable gifts in finance. The person who ignores free or matched contribution space is not being independent. He is rejecting acceleration. That is expensive, very expensive, because the first milestone is hard enough already without turning down free weight on your side of the scale. Now let me move to the third mechanism. I call it the handoff zone. This is where the game starts feeling different, not easy. Different. The handoff zone begins as you move toward and through the six-figure level. Around 100,000, the machine starts giving you something it could not give you at 10,000: material, visible help. Not enough to replace labor yet, enough to feel undeniable. This is where a lot of people finally see returns appear on the screen that look like what a side job might have earned, or what a monthly sacrifice might have taken to create. And the emotional effect is enormous, because now the money is no longer just nodding politely at your contributions. It is moving. This is the handoff. The burden begins shifting, not fully, meaningfully. That is why the second milestone matters more than most people realize. 100,000 is not only a larger number, it is a change in the engine S proportion of total work. Below that level, your contributions still dominate the story more than most people are comfortable with. Around and beyond that level, returns start becoming too large to ignore. You can watch the account move in a year by an amount that used to require months and months of your own deposits. That changes motivation, that changes identity, that changes your sense of what is possible. And this is where a terrible misunderstanding happens. People hear that the first 100,000 is the hardest and treat it like a quote. Fine. The deeper truth is why it is hardest. It is hardest because getting there requires crossing the longest psychological desert before compounding becomes visible enough to help you emotionally. That is the real hardness, not the arithmetic alone. The sequence of effort without applause. Once you reach 100,000, the machine finally starts behaving in a way normal people can feel. That is the handoff. Your labor is still important, your discipline is still important. But now the money is visibly participating, and visible participation changes everything. Now let me say something even harder. A lot of people would rather look busy than cross the hand. Off zone, they chase productivity hacks, income tricks, little side hustles, credit card games, trading fantasies, all the little dopamine, rich activities that make them feel financially active. Fine. Very often they do all of that to avoid the one thing that would actually matter most. Building the boring, slow, heavy base large enough that the machine can finally begin helping them at meaningful scale. That is the trap. They would rather feel clever now than rich later. I have no use for that. I want the handoff, always the handoff. And once you understand that, the path changes. You stop needing to be entertained by your financial life. You start needing it to become structurally stronger. That is a much more powerful mindset. Now, let me take this one step further. The idea people now call coast fire is just one expression of the handoff zone. If you build a large enough base early enough, time becomes strong enough to do most of the later heavy lifting without the same level of continued input. That is a beautiful thing. Not because everyone can stop contributing early. Most cannot. The deeper lesson is that money built early becomes a worker with decades of labor still ahead of it. That is what matters. Every year you delay that worker as hiring, you lose a full year of its future production. That is one reason waiting is so expensive. Not because waiting looks bad on paper, because waiting quietly kills future labor from an asset that could have been working the whole time. This is why I tell people to respect time more than talent. Talent is wonderful. Time compounds. That is a different thing. Now let me move to the fourth mechanism. I call it the million threshold. This is the point where the machine stops feeling like a helper and starts feeling like an institution. $1 million is not magic. It does not bless you. It does not make you wise. It does something much more practical. It gives scale to compounding at an 8% return. $1 million produces 80,000 in a year before tax and volatility reality complicate the experience. That is serious money. That is money that starts competing with jobs. That is money that changes the tone of your choices. This is why the third milestone matters. Not because 7 figures sound grand, because the relationship between labor and capital finally changes enough that work begins losing its monopoly over your options. That is the milestone. The average person still thinks about $1 million like a status symbol. I do not. I think about it as bargaining power. If your capital can produce a meaningful share of the income that used to come only from your labor, then your whole life changes. You negotiate differently. You endure less nonsense. You have more room to walk away. You have more room to rest. You have more room to choose. That is what money is for. Not applause, freedom. And this is where the 4% rule comes into the conversation, not as religion, but as a useful frame. At roughly 4% withdrawal, a large invested base may be able to support a long retirement horizon under historical assumptions. Fine, the exact number can be argued. Good, I am not worshiping the rule. I care about what it reveals. It reveals that at sufficient scale, Money no longer merely grows. It can be harvested. That is a different life. The account is not only an accumulation vehicle anymore. It is a life support engine. That is why the million threshold matters so much. Not because it makes you rich in some childish sense, because it turns capital into a force that can begin replacing what labor used to provide alone. That is the transition. Now let me say something important. Most people will never hit the million threshold if they think of the first two milestones as optional. That is why I keep taking you backward. You do not arrive at capital freedom by fantasizing about seven figures while refusing the psychological discipline of the blue zone and the handoff zone. The million is built inside those earlier humiliations. That is the truth. A person who cannot tolerate 10,000 without applause does not deserve 100,000. A person who cannot respect 100,000 as the hand off does not deserve the freedom a million can buy. That is not moralism. It is structure. The later number is nested inside the earlier discipline. Always. Now let me give you the fifth mechanism. I call it the contribution lie. This is one of the hardest truths in the whole story at the beginning. The lie is that contributions feel too small to matter. Later, the lie changes. Later, people start believing contributions no longer matter because compounding is doing more. That is also wrong. Both lies are expensive. Early contributions are almost everything. Late contributions are still rocket fuel, even when the machine starts helping you. Continuing to feed it matters. A person who reaches 100,000 and says, great, now the money can do it alone may still end up fine. A person who reaches 100,000 and continues contributing intelligently can end up in a completely different universe. This is why I dislike false binaries. Your money's work and your work are not enemies. They are phases of an alliance. At first, you carry the alliance later. The alliance becomes more equal. Then capital becomes dominant, but even then, thoughtful contributions can alter the slope of the whole curve that matters. Because a lot of people emotionally want to stop contributing the moment compounding becomes visible. That is understandable. It is also often premature. What you should stop doing is feeling alone. What you should continue doing is feeding the machine if your life permits it. That is how the biggest curves get built. Now let me take this into something even more practical. If someone invests $500 a month and reaches 100,000 in about 11 years under solid assumptions, that sounds long to people who still think emotionally. Fine. The time passes anyway. That is one of the deepest truths in finance. The question is not whether 11 years is long. The question is what is waiting for you at the end of the same 11 years if you do nothing. That comparison ends a lot of bad arguments quickly. Time is not your enemy. Time without direction is your enemy. That is the real difference. Now let me give you the sixth mechanism. I call it the motivation gap. This is the emotional canyon between understanding the math and behaving in accordance with it. A lot of people understand compounding conceptually. Very few behave as if they truly believe it. Why? Because compounding is most powerful over time horizons that the human mind struggles to feel. It is easier to feel a vacation, a purchase, a car, a night out, a better apartment, a lifestyle signal. It is much harder to feel 30 years of future optionality. That is why the motivation gap exists. The future is abstract, consumption is vivid. The abstract loses to the vivid unless the person develops a different relationship to time. This is why milestone thinking helps. It gives the future shape. 10,000 means proof. 100,000 means handoff. 1 million means bargaining power. Now the journey has formed that matters. People are more willing to suffer intelligently when the sequence is visible. And the sequence needs to be visible because the modern economy is explicitly engineered to reward impatience. The market sells you immediacy. Credit sells you acceleration. Advertising sells you comparison. Social media sells you performative wealth before actual wealth exists. All of it attacks long horizon behavior. That is why I do not call discipline a personality trait. I call it defensive architecture. If you want to cross the motivation gap, you need systems, automatic contributions, account structures that reduce friction. Employer matches captured without drama lifestyle decisions that preserve investable surplus, a peer environment that does not punish prudence. That is what closes the gap. Not hype. Design. Now let me move to the seventh mechanism. I call it the freedom threshold. This is what all of the milestones are really pointing toward, not the number on the screen. Freedom, the first threshold, gives you freedom from the lie that the machine does not work. The second gives you freedom from the feeling that you alone must always carry everything. The third gives you freedom from the idea that labor must remain your only meaningful source of income forever. That is why I care about these numbers. They change your financial physics. A person with 10,000 invested thinks differently than a person with zero. A person with 100,000 thinks differently than a person with 10,000. A person with 1,000,000 thinks differently than a person with 100,000. Not because the human being suddenly became superior, because the menu of possible lives changed. That is what capital does. It changes what you can say yes to and what you can say no to. It changes how much abuse you tolerate. It changes whether a bad boss is an inconvenience or a prison. It changes whether retirement is a fantasy or a plan. It changes whether time belongs entirely to other people or partly to you. That is the freedom threshold. And I want to say something else. The point is not to worship the milestone. The point is to understand what each milestone makes possible. That keeps you from doing two dumb things. First, it keeps you from dismissing the early numbers as trivial. Second, it keeps you from idolizing the later number, as though life only starts at 7 figures. Both errors are common, both are stupid. The first milestone matters because it changes identity. The second matters because it changes momentum. The third matters because it changes leverage. All three matter. Now let me give you the eighth mechanism. I call it the balance rule. This is where I want to close the emotional trap at the heart of the whole topic. A lot of people hear a story like this and imagine that the lesson must be sacrifice without air. No life, no joy. No travel, no break, no humanity until the machine is big enough to grant permission. That is not what I believe. Money is a tool, not a religion. It is supposed to support life, not replace it. The balance rule is simple. Do not destroy today. So thoroughly in the name of tomorrow that when tomorrow arrives you have forgotten how to live. That matters. A person who builds wealth but never learns how to use freedom intelligently can end up rich and emotionally empty. That is not success. It is delayed confusion. But balance is not the same thing as indulgence. Balance means you build the machine while still permitting life, not every desire life. That is an important distinction. The way to do that is not through chaos. It is through rules. Contributions first, lifestyle second. Future claims built monthly. Enjoyment allowed deliberately, not accidental drift, not endless austerity structure. This is why I say wealth is not a morality contest. It is a systems contest. Bad systems make people feel alternately deprived and ashamed. Good systems let people progress without needing motivational speeches every week to continue. That is the kind of system I want for you. Now let me make the identity flip explicit. Most people think the goal is to get rich. Too vague, too childish. The real goal is to stop being the only engine. That is the flip. A person who thinks only in terms of getting rich chases noise, speed, image, and often nonsense. A person who wants to stop being the only engine becomes patient, structural, and very hard to distract. The first person wants stories. The second person wants systems. The first person wants to feel rich. The second person wants the machine to become stronger than his moods. Those are different people. The market pays them very differently. Now let me bring the operating system together in plain language. First, accept that early wealth building feels unfair because it is mostly your labor carrying the curve. Second, respect 10,000 as proof, not as a triviality. Third, treat 100,000 as the handoff, the point where the money visibly begins helping. Fourth, understand 1 million not as a trophy, but as a freedom threshold where capital starts competing seriously with labor. Fifth, use tax advantages, matches, and every available structural tailwind because they shorten the blue zone. Sixth, keep contributing even after compounding becomes visible, because visible help is not the same thing as finished work. Seventh, build systems strong enough to close the motivation gap. Eighth, protect balance, so the machine serves life instead of replacing it. That is the operating system, not hype, not magic, not luck. Sequence. Now let me put the blade into this as cleanly as I can. The 3 net worth milestones that change everything are not important because some influencer put them in a thumbnail. They matter because each one changes the ratio between your work and your money. S work at 10,000, the machine proves it is alive. At 100,000, it proves it can help. At 1 million, it proves it can carry real weight. That is the whole story. And if you remember nothing else from what I said, remember this. Most people quit in the phase where they are still doing all the work and the money is still too weak to flatter them. That is why most people never see what happens when the machine finally becomes strong enough to change their life. Do not be most people, cross the blue zone, reach proof, push through the hand, and one day you will wake up and realize the thing that used to need your constant labor has become something else entirely. An ally, a force, a machine that works while you sleep, that is when everything changes.